Hello, beautiful people. Welcome to this week's episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. I'm your host, Olga Peters, and this is the show where we talk about how everything in Montpelier shakes out for the rest of us. I want to welcome to today's show regular contributor and representative from Brattleboro, Emily Kornheiser. Hey there, Emily.
Hi, Olga. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you. You're looking very summery in this first week of August.
I
In your
am
little spot.
trying. Despite the weather, I'm doing my best to appreciate summer.
And despite the rain, yes. Well, I think that brings us, August, nearing the end of summer and getting ready for the autumn and getting ready for school to begin and all those transition things brings me to today's episode because I have been thinking a lot about transitions and all the things that they mean. And inheritance and what we inherit from our ancestors and what we bring forward into the world as the ancestors that we are becoming, which brought me to modern Vermont and thinking about our ancestors, our political ancestors, and what we have basically passively inherited from them, whether we grew up in Vermont or we moved to Vermont. We showed up and Vermont is here with the roads and the government and the telephone wires and everything. And meanwhile, we are also actively creating the future and future Vermont. So we are ourselves always in this transition place between the past and the future. And so I thought for the rest of August, during this transition month into autumn, we should hear from some of our political ancestors and just touch base and see what they were thinking at their time. And as we go forward over the rest of August, I've chosen some inaugural speeches from different governors across Vermont's history. And I tried to choose something that they themselves looked like they were in a transitional historical time. So, for example, one of the speeches we might read is from during the time of the Civil War. It's not the first year or the last year of the Civil War. I'm choosing something from kind of in the middle, or right after the flood of 1927, but before the crash of the Great Depression. So again, trying to choose speeches that are in a transition time and see what people were thinking about.
Olga, I love that so much. On Monday at the e-board meeting, Tom Cavett, our state economist, was talking about sort of a history of the economy and flood responses. And he started talking about a flood in the 1800s. And I was like, what are we doing here? This is like both incredible and absurd, right? That and I'm doing that, listening to him sitting on the original state house chairs covered in velvet, in the governor's ceremonial office. And I know that through the pandemic, we talked a lot about how sort of extra aware we were that we were living through history and creating history. But, in the happy hour, one of our sort of founding mottos is that we're like sort of digging into the story behind the story. And I think there's nothing more powerful than really going back and hearing how people were telling those stories that we're still living with today. So I really appreciate you coming up with this August scheme for us.
Oh, well, thank you. I hope our listeners enjoy it. So without further ado, let's jump in. The Secretary of State's office has a whole page devoted to inaugural and farewell speeches from
Really?
across Vermont's. Yeah, it's so cool. You can click on by year. The way we think of inaugural speeches is not how it's always been done. And so some years are kind of missing because maybe a governor didn't do one. Farewell speeches didn't really become a thing until later in history. But it's still an interesting little treasure trove. So Emily and I are going to start with Vermont's first governor, Thomas Chittenden. That name might sound familiar. For those who don't know, however, he was originally born in Connecticut and moved to Williston during the time when the United States was not the United States, but a colony. and he moved to Vermont and did his own settlement colonization thing when we were still being disputed about, were we Vermont, were we New York, were we New Hampshire, during the whole land grant period of time before the American Revolution. American Revolution breaks out. He is one of several people of who you will probably recognize some names as we go forward in these readings, who were like, well, again, who is Vermont? Are we New York? Are we New Hampshire? Are we Canada? Are we still part of Britain? Or are we our own identity? So, as folks probably know, in 1777, Vermont decided it was its own republic, or these political leaders did, anyways. And Thomas Chittenden was one of, I believe, 8 people who was part of what was called the Council of Safety, which formed as the initial interim government of the Republic of Vermont to get the state up and running, to found the government, to elect officials, to get the General Assembly put together. And they worked with the Continental Congress, saying we are our own land, we don't belong to New York, we don't belong to New Hampshire, we are our own state. For whatever reason, New York was still contesting that. So in March 3rd, which I'm thinking might be the first Tuesday in March, 1778, this Council of Safety held elections to put together the Vermont's first General Assembly, which convened for the first time in 1778. So, without further ado, Emily, I would love to hear Thomas Chittenden's inaugural address.
So this is the executive speech of Thomas Chittenden as it appears in the records of the Governor and Council of the State of Vermont, 1779. This was on October 14th. Gentlemen of the Council and Assembly, the honor conferred on me by the freemen of this state in appointing me their chief magistrate demands a return of my warmest thanks. At the same time, I regret my inabilities to support the character of so important a station. Notwithstanding as my appointment appears so unanimous, it affords me the highest satisfaction, is to me a confirmation of their general approbation of my former conduct. Therefore, I shall consider it my duty to serve the ensuing year, and by divine assistance shall labor to continue an equal steady firmness and impartial administration of justice, which has hitherto governed my conduct, relying on the candor and assistance of my council and the legislature for my support. Gentlemen, the legislature having constitutionally met, I cannot forbear expressing to you my highest satisfaction in the many great and important advantages arising from the due execution and careful administration of the laws, since they took place, and cannot but rejoice when I reflect on the infinite difference between a state of anarchy and that of a well-regulated government, the latter of which we daily experience. And I most earnestly recommend to all magistrates and others in authority under me, together with the freemen over whom I have the honor to preside, to persevere and let their conduct be uniformly met, just, and upright, and encourage one another to unite in the supporting and maintaining their common rights, which cannot fail to recommend the state to the impartial world. At the same time, I am unhappy to inform you that, notwithstanding the generous and lenient measures with which the disaffected inhabitants in the lower part of Cumberland County have been indulged, yet they continue in their unjustifiable obstinacy against the authority of the state. I shall, however, recommend the suspension of the laws intended to have been executed on these offenders at present, in consequence of a letter received from His Excellency, John J. Esquire, President of Congress, enclosing certain acts passed by that honorable board related to a final settlement of all differences subsisting between this and the adjacent states, which I now submit to you for your consideration, a subject of the greatest importance, and demands your most serious attention. Your agents to Congress have attended, agreeable to their instructions from time to time. Their proceedings I shall now lay before you for your perusal and approbation, which I hope will prove satisfactory. From every circumstance, I think we have the highest reason to believe that from the efforts of our agents and the interposition of Congress, our unhappy disputes with the neighboring states will soon terminate in a final and happy issue. With respect to the present situation of the domestic affairs of state, it is with pleasure that I inform you that the measures pursued by the Board of War by the assistance of divine providence, have proved effectually sufficient to defend our frontiers against the ravages of the common enemy, while they have been permitted to execute their horrid vengeance on many of the innocent inhabitants of the different parts of the continent, which in some measure proves the approbation of heaven to our independence, and justifies the measures pursued to support and defend it. As the time for which the troops now in service are engaged expires the middle of November next, you will be careful to make such provisions for future defense as your wisdom shall direct. I shall from time to time during the session, I'm going to try that again. I shall from time to time during the session digest and communicate to you such other matters as shall appear to me to require your attention, in a full confidence that the same zeal to promote the common cause for which the inhabitants of the state have hitherto been distinguished will be equally conspicuous in your deliberations. There are a few footnotes. Shall I read those, Olga?
Why don't you? Because they pertain to, I think, the conflict that was going on between Vermont and New York at that time. And they're pretty strident.
Yes. So there's one, it's the second footnote, and it's refers to sort of the act that was essentially sort of like repealed in the face of the pardon. The act especially referred to as that of June 1779 to prevent persons from exercising authority unless lawfully authorized by the state, which, though in general terms, was of course specially aimed against all persons who should attempt to act in the name and by the authority of New York. So the penalty for the first offense was a fine not exceeding 100 pounds. For the second, not exceeding 40 striped on the naked body. That's a whipping, folks.
Yes.
And for the third, the right ear was to be nailed to a post and cut off, and the forehead was to be branded with the letter C, which might have been for contumacious, a word I have no idea what it means, with a hot iron.
Right?
No
yeah,
good.
my eyeballs popped out just a little bit on that one.
So that is the speech of Thomas Chittenden.
Thank you. I am going to read now his farewell speech, which is from 1797. And just for context, folks, when Emily read his inaugural speech, Thomas Chittenden served basically from 1779 to 1797, until his death in 1797. And with the exception of 1 year, where a gentleman by the name of Moses Robinson stepped in, he was the governor that whole time, Thomas Chittenden was. And so when I'm reading this farewell speech, we are no longer the Republic of Vermont. We are now the state of Vermont and part of the United States of America. So again, another big transition has happened. So we shall read that now. Executive speech of Thomas Chittenden, as it appears in the records of the Governor and Council of the State of Vermont, Volume 2, 1779, and this is from October 14th, 1779. Gentlemen of the Council and Assembly, the honor conferred on me by the free men of this state in appointing me their chief magistrate demands a return of my warmest thanks. At the same time,
I think you're reading the wrong one.
I'm reading the wrong one. Okay, good thing. We can edit that one. Okay, let's try this again. Thank you, listeners, for bearing with me. Too many screens open. Okay. Executive speech of Thomas Chittenden, as it appears in the records of the Governor and Council of the State of Vermont, Volume 4, 1796, Tuesday, October 18th. Gentlemen of the Council and Assembly, you are so well knowing to the manifold favors and blessings bestowed on us as a people by the great ruler of the universe, that it would be unnecessary for me to recapitulate them. I would therefore only observe that but a few years since we were without constitution, law, or government, in a state of anarchy and confusion, at war with a potent foreign power, opposed by a powerful neighboring state, discountenanced by the Congress, distressed by internal dissensions, all our landed property in imminent danger, and without the means of defense. Now your eyes behold the happy day when we are in the full and uninterrupted enjoyment of a well-regulated government, suited to the situation and genius of the people, acknowledged by all the powers of the earth, supported by the Congress, at peace with our sister states, among ourselves, and all the world. From whence did these great blessings come? From God. Are they not worth enjoying? They surely are. Does it not become us as a people to improve them, that we may have reason to hope that they may be continued to us and transmitted to posterity? It certainly does. What are the most likely measures to be taken by us as a people to obtain this great end? To be faithful, virtuous, industrious, and moral people. Does it not become us, as a legislature, to take every method in our power to encourage virtue, industry, morality, religion, and learning? I think it does. Is there any better method that can be taken by us to answer this purpose than by our own example and having a sacred regard to virtue, industry, integrity, and morality in all our appointments of executive and judicial offices? This is the day we have appointed to nominate all our subordinate executive and judicial officers through the state for the present year. The people, by their free suffrages, have given us the power, and in us they have placed their confidence, and to God, to them, and our own consciousnesses, we are accountable. Suffer me, sir, as a leader, as a father, as a friend, and a lover of this people, and as one whose voice cannot be much longer heard here, to instruct you in all your appointments, to have regard to none but those who maintain a good moral character, men of integrity, and distinguished for wisdom and abilities. In doing this, you will encourage virtue, which is the glory of a people, and discountenance and discourage vice and profaneness, which is a reproach to any people. And thus ends the speech. So, Emily, I heard some interesting themes there and some echoes, I think, but I would love to hear from you, because I think I've been sitting with these maybe a little bit longer than you have, and I'm curious what your initial reaction is.
Well, my very first initial reaction is I often think that political speeches today have a few too many words in them. And it seems that we have a long history of that. So
Although these were both shorter than I think the ones we
they
tend to
are
hear now.
shorter, but they also have a little bit less content. So anyway, there was a little, some excess pageantry, I would say, but I do believe that's how it works. And whenever I complain about it to colleagues in the midst of politicaling, everyone says, this is how it works. Why are you complaining about it? So that's my first reaction, but not I guess the most important one, even though I led with it. So it's sort of amazing to see the story unfolding in chaos and then the story sort of resolving itself, and how quickly we seem to have moved from pride and some rage and some retribution kind of feelings to absolute self-congratulation and resolve. And I think that was the piece that struck me the most.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Is that it's all been resolved, and it was because we are so wonderful.
Yes, I had a similar feeling in that I appreciated how chaotic and scary a time these folks were living through. I mean, they were living through multiple wars essentially. And there is probably, so for that I forgive them some of their self-gratulatory backslapping, because it probably did feel like a massive lift to found a republic, found a government, and then become part of a new country. At the same time, I think you and I are aware, looking back, in part because we had no skin in the game, all the pieces that are missing and all the people that are missing
Mm-hmm.
from the story at this time. And that was just very, just very aware of that. Um, and I was very aware that this is a new colony. And when I was reading the initial inaugural speech, when he was talking about enemies,
Mm.
it was like, are you talking about the British? Are you talking about um, the indigenous communities? Are you talking about New York? Like this just general just enemies
Mm-hmm.
uh, was just stuck out to me. The other thing that stuck out to me is it really felt to me that I could see the beginnings of Vermont exceptionalism just sort of sprinkled through here.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and at times when he was talking about, and I think I heard it in things like, oh, good character, moral character, blah blah blah, we have to be an example for others, you know,
Mm-hmm.
that all sounded like Vermont exceptionalism to me.
Mm-hmm.
And like you, I wanted there to be a little more content.
Mm-hmm.
Like, let's actually talk about what you achieved, in
Mm-hmm.
part because this is a historic record, or a historical record, and like us, we're looking back at this.
Yeah.
What were some of the things you actually did?
Mm-hmm.
And there wasn't, it felt, well, kind of felt like a group of friends sitting around a campfire having a little chat. The other thing that struck me is in some of the ways Chittenden talked about being governor, it felt much more like an executive director talk, of like a nonprofit organization talking to his board
Mm-hmm.
than um a, a s- uh, an individual leader, like
Tell
a
me more
leader
about
who's
what you mean
out.
by that. Why do you say that?
Yeah, why do I say that? There was language in there, and I'm trying to think what, I'm trying to remember the specific language, but it sounded much more like I'm reporting to you. You know, throughout the year, I'm going to inform you of, and for you to make decisions.
Mm-hmm.
Where when I hear modern governors speak, it's more like, I'm going to do this, and I hope you agree with me. Like it just felt a little bit more like he was deferring to the General Assembly.
Ah.
Yeah, more than just like, I'm the governor and I'm the top dog of the state government.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't feel that way to quite the same extent.
Mm-hmm.
So that stood out to me as well.
Mm-hmm. I hear that. I wondered if it was sort of a style of speech versus a reality of communication. Because my
Hmm,
understanding
possible.
is that the legislature has gotten weaker and weaker and has gotten stronger and stronger and stronger over time. Um,
Okay.
but it's possible that at the
In,
beginning it was just like, like 12 men that all knew each other and hung out drinking brandy together. So things were
I think that Yep.
Yes.
Hmm.
um,
You know, you in oh, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, you know, on sorry, on previous episodes, you and I have talked about how people organize themselves and that
Mhm.
government is one of the way people organize themselves. For you, this transition and this discussion in here, you know, talking about anarchy versus a well governed structure or a well structured government, however you want to put it.
Mhm.
What how does that sit with you?
Well, I definitely noted it. I think that, he is using anarchy there as sort of a description of lawlessness and war mongering and, pinning people's ears to the post. Um, and, a well-oiled government, by white men, for white men, to be about sort of commerce and prosperity. And, I think we're still rolling with that one
Mhm.
around here. What I'm not sure about and I'm curious about is I don't know where the independent country of Vermont sort of fits into all of this.
Right?
You?
This is, you know, it's well, I think this was a perfect moment in and after August, maybe we need to pull in a historian and ask some of these questions
Okay.
because, you know, on the show we talk about digging into the stories
Hmm.
that kind of build policy or that we tell about other people, that type of thing.
Hmm.
And to me, both these speeches are just laden with stories. But I was sitting with my own stories and you know, I think the story I was handed down about the Republic of Vermont is that it was this massive independent movement and we were going to be our own country and nobody could tell us what to do and you know rah 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 Vermont sort of thing. And yet when I was going through some of these early speeches, it didn't feel that way. It didn't feel it felt like, and I don't know if this is true, but this is what it felt like to me when I was reading the speeches is it's like, well, we actually want to be a state, but we can't be right now because of all these other conflicts going on. So, you know, we'll do a republic until we can become part of the United States is
Until
really what it feels
Congress will be
like.
on our side, basically.
Yeah. Yeah,
Hmm.
until Congress will recognize us as our as a sovereign state and tell New York to back off. And that to me is a very different story
Yeah.
than what I grew up with.
Hmm.
And so yeah, I understand why that's not clear to you in part because I think it goes against the story that we have been told.
Hmm. I hear that. Hmm.
Mhm.
I wish we had a historian hanging out with us, Olga, because my Vermont history is, well, I have a bunch of books about it. I have not read them very thoroughly yet. Um,
Yes.
so I feel like I have a fairly good sense of Vermont tax history, but not Vermont political history more broadly.
Mhm. Yeah.
The other thing, you mentioned that first Tuesday in March. Um, is that real? Is that really why town meeting is that day?
Well, I'm curious. I'm curious because I don't know if while we're talking I will see if I can pull up a calendar and see what day it was, but I think that's the first Tuesday in March.
That's so fun.
And it would seem because that is such a tradition for us.
Hmm.
And I always wondered why it was then. And I don't know.
Wow.
Oops, I can't talk and look at my phone
No,
at the same
it's
time.
too
Sorry,
much.
folks.
Too much. We
Well,
can we can follow up with folks on that one at a later date.
yes, we can. And I something about General Assembly. Oh, I am still very intrigued, and I may do some more reading on this, so if I learn something, I'll bring it back to the listeners. I'm intrigued by this Council of Safety.
Yes, I'm sorry. I wrote that down and didn't even say anything. Yes.
Right? I
You go ahead.
no,
Oh,
no, please.
no.
Mm.
um, the sort of shadowing in that first speech about, the anarchy and the violence, and we are sort of, trying to wrest this state from the jaws of whatever, and founding a council of safety, and just, this is just sort of what leaders and politicians have done for a
Mhm.
very long time, is, you know, govern from a place of fear, I guess.
Mhm.
And there's just so much to be afraid of. I'm not saying that like war and chaos and having your ear nailed to a tree is not something to be terrified of. It
Yeah,
is.
we're never gonna get
Uh,
over that.
it's it's just like, even that word safety is something that we've spent a lot of time about, how it means something so different to different people. Safety for who, safety why, safety at whose expense,
Mhm.
all of that.
Mhm.
And that, even the governing body would be called the Council of Safeties.
Yeah, and that it was a fairly small council.
Hmm.
Uh, yeah, oh, I'm just gonna give the names of the people who, according to the Vermont Historical Society, were on this,
Hmm.
because I think some of them might sound familiar. Thomas Chittenden,
Hmm.
Nathan Clark, Jonas and Joseph Fay, Moses Robinson, Ira and Heman Allen, and Matthew Lyon. And I think many of them have portraits in the State House. I know Matthew Lyon definitely does, and of course we know the Allen boys.
Hmm.
What I found, what you were just saying about the Council of Safety, one, that they even called it that, and it reminded me, it also made me think of Chittenden's references to things like morality and staying away from profaneness and good character. To me, those are also things that mean different things to different people. And so when I was reading those words, a little bit for me, it was like, well, by whose definition?
Hmm.
What's morality by your definition? What is that, Thomas Chittenden?
Yeah.
And I have to say the term Freeman makes me very uncomfortable. Uh, and it's like, yeah, not true for everybody, kind of thing.
Mhm.
Um, but obviously, it was a very important distinction for them because they use it quite often, which tells us a lot about that part of history as well.
I do, yeah. I really go back and forth with like interpreting history from the frame that I'm sitting with today, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
There's the words that they used, unexamined, right?
Yeah. Well, I'm very aware of the fact that we are looking at them through our own
Mhm.
lenses,
Yeah.
and we are looking at this speech through, like we started this conversation, what we have inherited.
Mhm.
Um, and it struck me though, while I was reading these speeches, it gave me a new perspective on judging history, in that one reason it's so easy to do is because we have no skin in that game. I mean, yes, we are living with the consequences of it, but it's not our decisions that were good or bad.
Mhm.
It's not our decisions that helped people or hurt people. So we can Monday morning quarterback the heck out of these things, uh, because it's not our glass house we're living,
Yeah.
throwing stones at. Um, and yet there will come a time when people, this is what fascinates me, is we are the future ancestors. People will look back at the decisions we made and be like, oh, that warming solutions act, can you believe they thought that's how you deal with climate change?
Mhm. Yeah.
at that point, it was the best act that could be created at the time.
Do you think
But
people are gonna sample this podcast in a future podcast to talk about history?
ooh, and what do you think? Do you think they'll be like, "Wow, they were so insightful," or do you think they'll be
I
like,
think
"Oh yeah."
definitely we will just be the heroes of the future, Olga. I have no doubts, no doubt.
It's
I
very
love
good thing that we won't know that though.
I love the first sentence of the last paragraph here. Suffer me, sir, as a leader, as a father, as a friend, and a lover of this people, and as one whose voice cannot be much longer heard here.
I'm glad you read that because that I think is actually a line that was my favorite that I read, and perhaps spurred a lot of my reasons for doing these next five,
Mhm,
because that was a moment where I think I saw Thomas Chittenden mostly as a human being
mhm.
and not just a political figure.
Oh, that's so interesting. I saw it as like, wow, that's such a political technique that he's using that people, in order to make himself look more human, that people use all the time. I remember even when I went through Emerge, sort of the training program for women in politics, we were really told to emphasize like, you know, I'm here as a mother, and I felt so uncomfortable about it. I still feel uncomfortable about it. But I understand, like, the point of it is like, that is much more resonant and relatable to, the majority of people than other things. So
So the question is, was that a political tactic, or because it worked, it became a political tactic?
I I think I think probably a little bit of each.
Well, I am perfectly emotionally gullible enough to fall for it. So
Oh, I appreciate that
so it
you're
worked, Thomas Chittenden.
I appreciate that you're a human, dear Olga.
Oh, that's funny.
Mhm.
So, what are some of your outstanding questions that we should maybe take note of and talk to a historian about? I think we should gather these as we go through the next 5 Fridays.
I want to understand how the independent country of Vermont fits into all of this.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I want to know what the F this Council of Safety is and what power they had.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
They wrote the Constitution.
yes, but like other than that, yes. Um, I want to know a little bit more about the relationships between all those people.
Yeah.
Um, and a little bit more about sort of what the powers of this new legislature were compared
Mm.
to today.
Mm-hmm.
Those are my like top questions I'm walking away with. What about you?
Um, Definitely I have new curiosity in the Republic of Vermont and what that meant and how it fits in
Mhm.
to not just Vermont history, but New England history and, early US history. And the Council of Safety. Um, yeah, that was a whole new thing for me. I'd never heard of that.
Mhm.
I didn't realize. I knew our Constitution had been written by, a group of people, because
Mhm.
really that's the only way it's gonna happen.
Yeah.
But that it had this intent to be an interim government, was new to me. As far as relationships, I think, again, how we have talked about how Vermont is so relationship based,
Mhm.
and like you find your plow guy through your best friend's neighbor's mother, kind of thing. Um, I do believe Thomas Chittenden, when he moved to Williston, he bought the land that he built his house on from one of the Allen brothers.
Mm.
Might have been Ira, but so there you go. There's an
Mhm.
early relationship right there. Um, yeah, powers of the how the legislature's powers have changed. I think that's a podcast in of itself.
Mhm. That
Um,
sounds fun.
yeah, I think that would be its own show. Um, So yes, I'm on the same thing, and I think I would also ask if people had this information. I find it interesting that Thomas Chittenden served as long as he did through this transition, and part of me feels, okay, I can see the consistency, the value in having a consistent leader through a transition time. But I also wonder, having the same person as governor, um, did that calcify anything?
Hmm, interesting.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a big question for today.
Mhm.
I also um that reference to enemies, and it seemed like there are better enemies and worst enemies. I'd love someone with a little more context to dig that one up. Because as you said, I was wondering, is it the British? Is it the indigenous Americans? Is it like who are we talking about here?
Is it people who just don't agree with us because we
Yeah,
wanna create a state and they wanna be part of New York?
which would be all of those people, right? So yeah,
Right.
very curious about that. Yes.
Okay. Well, I think that is really the time we have for today.
It's great because that's all I have
I
to
know
say
we've
today, Olga.
Exactly, exactly. So I just want to thank everyone for showing up today. I want to thank Emily for being here. And I hope you stay with us for the next Fridays to hear more from our political ancestors. I also want to thank all the underwriters on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station, for supporting this station and its work. I want to thank Brattleboro Community Television for sharing our video version of our podcast with other stations around Vermont. And of course, I want to thank all our listeners for being here. Hey, Emily, where can people find more information if they're looking for you?
Folks should remember that the views and opinions expressed here on the Montpelier Happy Hour are those of the host and the guests, respectively, and not the station. And folks can find me at emilykornheiser.org.
Thank you. You can always find the Montpelier Happy Hour on Fridays at 2 p.m. on WVEW, as well as rebroadcast on Wednesday mornings at 8 a.m. You can find us wherever you subscribe to your podcast. And you can always, if you have your own questions about history and our governors, send us an email at the Montpelier Happy Hour at gmail.com. Have a great weekend, everyone.